Ultimately, we homeschool because it works for us to have our kids learn in groups of children of varying ages with a lot of emphasis on imagination and play and being outdoors. We get to help them pursue what they're passionate about, and that makes us feel like we're doing it right. Truth be told, my kids can't imagine that there are children who go to school without having their mama or their dada nearby. And I think that's kind of sweet. Their sense of learning and adventure goes hand in hand with our sense of presence and guidance. This is how we show them how much we love, honor, and respect their learning process. And we simply love to be a part of it.
We know this coming school year will be like no other. Students and staff will be screened for illness before they enter the school. Children will be asked to stay distant from classmates. They won't be sharing pencils or textbooks. And one important note is that opening schools will depend on our health metrics. We very much want to open the school buildings, but we won't open them and make a reckless decision when it's so important.
Good evening. My name is Tammy Fitzgerald, and I'm your host tonight for another episode of the NC Values Voice. This week, students across the state are wrapping up one of the most unusual school years that Americans can remember. Once the target of late-night comedy routines, this year everyone was a homeschooler, participating in distance learning thanks to coronavirus. In North Carolina, families have many options for education that did not exist even 10 years ago. In addition to traditional public schools, there are now public magnet schools, public charter schools, and even public online schools. Parents can join homeschool co-ops, send their children to private schools, or decide to directly teach their children at home. As states evaluate the new CDC guidelines for classrooms in the fall, and more parents are taking a closer look at homeschooling. In North Carolina, over 142,000 students are already educated at home. Why? Well, if you'll remember, for years we've been drawing your attention to the progressive political and social agendas being daily woven into our public school classrooms. In September, our investigations revealed the outrageous social justice curriculum being forced on children in Wake County schools. Then in February, Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools were requiring students to participate in surveys that reveal sexual behavior and gender preference. You can visit ncvalues.org to read more about these egregious activities in our schools. But tonight, we are hosting a robust discussion to answer questions and provide resources for parents who want to start homeschooling this fall. Joining in the discussion of homeschool options tonight are Angie Cutlip and Brenda Brown, two well-known North Carolina homeschool veterans who have taught in various public schools, private schools, and even at the community college level before beginning their homeschool journey. Angie resides in Wendell, North Carolina, and her husband and two daughters, and Brenda resides in Concord, North Carolina, with her husband and two boys. Also joining in on the program tonight is Reagan Waits, who is currently a staff intern at the North Carolina Values Coalition. Reagan just successfully completed her second year at the Liberty University School of Law, where she is working on her goal of being involved in Christian public policy and elections. So we want to welcome all three of you to the program tonight.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you.
Well, Brenda, for parents that may not be ready to send their children back to traditional classrooms this fall, how do they go about the process of determining if homeschooling is right for their family? I mean, what are the three most important points to consider if they want to begin homeschool this year?
Well, first of all, I would say as a Christian, the first thing to consider is the spiritual nature. As you just mentioned, there are things that are being taught in public schools that are antithetical to a Christian worldview. So the Bible tells us that when a child is fully trained, he will be like his teacher. So if you want to disciple your children, one of the best ways to do that is through homeschooling. So that would be my first thing that I would consider. The second thing would be that you can tailor the curriculum and what you're teaching to the needs of your child. That doesn't happen when there are 25 children. I've been in a public school classroom, private school classroom, and it's just not possible. What I could do with my own children could never have happened, which is why I made the choice. It could have never have happened in a group because I took what my child needed and then I just tailored it to them. So that would be the second thing, is that individualized instruction and how important that is. And then, of course, making sure that you're legal, because that's important to follow the guidelines that North Carolina has set aside. The third thing I would say would be 1 year is not that big of a deal. I know that there are a lot of parents who are thinking, I don't know what I can do after this year. I'm just looking at this year, and that's okay. You can take it 1 year at a time. 1 year in a child's life is not going to make or break them academically in any way. And I would say just enjoy that time. If you decide I need to do this and I don't know how long it's going to last, that's okay. Enjoy the time that you have, the journey of being with your child, and then just kind of take it from there. Don't feel like this has to be a decision that is long term that I can't get out of once I make that decision.
Those are great points. I really appreciate the 3 points. As someone who homeschooled for 2 years, my own children, I can say you should just think about it 1 year at a time. And I enjoyed the 2 years immensely and would have continued to do it. But I had a daughter who wanted to go back to school. So how many years did you homeschool, Brenda?
I homeschooled the entire time. So 13 years.
Wow.
So I have twins, and so they're finishing at the same time. And so we started from the very beginning and just finished this year.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, Angie, what about you? How long have you been homeschooling?
I have homeschooled for 19 years now. I taught in public school for 11 years, and I've homeschooled for 19.
Wow, that's great. That's awesome. Well, Angie, if parents decide to start homeschooling this year, like you did over 15 years ago, what are the current requirements in North Carolina to begin to educate at home? And is there a deadline to formally withdraw your children from enrollment at the current public or private school?
Yes, actually, it's important that families who are considering homeschooling to make sure that they understand that homeschooling is guided by North Carolina legislation. And so the Department of Administration oversees homeschooling. And if you're planning to homeschool this fall, you don't want to open your homeschool any earlier than July. And I'll explain that a little bit later in a minute. But the first thing that you need to do to legally open your homeschool, some of you are unofficially homeschooling right now, but if you decide to homeschool, you'll legally open your homeschool. And the first step is to file what is called an NOI, which is a notice of intent. And the notice of intent is just to let the state know that you're going to be operating a school. And so you can't just say, I'm going to homeschool in the summer just for grade recovery. That's not an option. And your homeschool must maintain being open until the chief administrator closes out your homeschool. It's also important to know that there's no more than 2 families by the current legislation that can be homeschooled in one homeschool. That's really important to know. As the homeschool parent, you're responsible for determining the scope and sequence. I've had people call me because I'm a homeschool consultant, and they're like, well, who's going to plan my lessons? And I'm like, you are. So that's going to be your responsibility. That's the main reason that you're homeschooling your kids, is so that you can plan what is best for them. You'll be providing their academic instruction. You'll also be determining any additional sources. For example, both of my daughters, I chose not to teach them chemistry because I didn't think that I was the best to do that. And so we took that at a homeschool co-op. My other daughter this year, she'll also be doing an art class. So there you can use outsourcing schools to help you, but you determine what's best, like Brenda said, what's best for your individual students. So you have to notify the North Carolina Department of Non-Public Education if there is a change in your address or if there's a change in your enrollment. It's actually very simple to do. I'll send you the link so that you can post that. It'll show right where you go online at the Department of Administration to open your homeschool and file your intent. I don't know how it's going to be this year because hopefully we're going to have a lot of homeschoolers, but in the past, people have gotten that back very quickly. And And so it's very important if you're homeschooling to remember when you look at that website to pay careful attention to the words requirements, reminders, and recommendations, because some people get caught up. Make sure you're looking at what am I required to do and what are the recommendations. So that's very important. And there are so many things on the page, but you're responsible. If you're going to homeschool your child, you're going to be their guidance counselor. You're their teacher, you're their parent, you're their chauffeur. You're going to be responsible for transcripts, for grades, and all that. And so it's really important that you just do your homework. But that can sound a little overwhelming, but it's not, because there are people that will support you through that situation. When you file your notice of intent, you will be creating a name for your homeschool. Keep in mind, this will be a name that will be on your diploma. I've heard some interesting names. If you fail to assign your homeschool a name, the state will give you a homeschool name, and they'll take your last name and they'll add school to it. So they would, if I had not have chosen a name for my school, I would have been the Cutlip School. And I don't want my school called the Cutlip School. So I named our school Valley Pine Christian Academy. And that's a normal name. It's named after our street. The other thing that you'll do is when you file your intent, it literally takes less than 5 minutes to fill out the form. You will elect how you will operate your homeschool. You can either operate your homeschool as a religious school or a non-religious school, and that's up to your personal preferences. You're also responsible for maintaining your immunization records and your annual attendance and a standardized achievement test. So basically it boils down to 4 things. You file a notice of intent, you maintain attendance, you make sure that you have your immunizations maintained or exempt status, and you administer a test each year that you homeschool. If your child is not yet 7, or your child will not turn 7 during this next school year, you do not file a notice of intent. You can homeschool by North Carolina law for students 7 and under. But if your child, or if your child is 18 or over, you do not file a notice of intent. And in North Carolina, there are no notice of intents filed during the months of May and June. And that's why earlier I had said, if you're planning to the homeschool this fall, you'll make sure that I would not register your homeschool until July. I would also make sure that you notify the school where your child would plan to go. I mean, let them know your intentions, that you are going to be homeschooling. You can also go to your current school that you've had, and you can ask for a photocopy of their cumulative record. So those are basically the things. It's actually very easy in North Carolina. Every state is different, and we're very blessed in North Carolina that we have homeschool laws that are not over regulatory in North Carolina.
That's great to hear, Angie. And I'm glad you boiled it down to the top 4 things, because I think that's helpful to parents who are considering homeschooling. If you are considering homeschooling, I just wanted to let you know it is the 2nd largest choice for parents for North Carolina education. So Brenda, you were fortunate to have taught for many years as a teacher before starting to educate your sons at home. And I've heard many parents say they couldn't possibly educate their children at home because they don't have a teaching certificate or a teaching background. So what are the requirements of homeschool teachers in North Carolina? And if you do not have a teaching background, where do you go for help?
Well, it's very simple. All you need is a high school diploma. So everybody can do it. So you don't have to have any kind of teaching background or teaching certificate. And I don't know about Angie, but for me, it actually was a detriment for me to have a teaching certificate. And I know that sounds crazy.
Yeah.
But it's true, because I was so focused on classroom and how things had been done and 25 students. And that's not what homeschooling is about at all. Homeschooling is about your child, what is best for them, not the curriculum that comes down from the state or from private school administrator. You get to choose, and you look at your child and you say, hey, this is the type of learner they are. You've been parenting them since they were born. So really, homeschooling is just an extension of the parenting that you've already been doing. So where do you go? you just lean on those same parenting skills and start there. And then you just look at this child and say, okay, this child is not like my other child, because if you have two, they're not the same ever. They're not the same, not even close. So and you say, okay, what do they need? Oh, well, I have one child who needs to learn by doing. So I'm going to tailor what I'm doing for them. I have another child who learns by reading or by listening. Well, then what they're going to do is going to be different. And so you don't need a teaching certificate for that, because everything that you need, you really are equipped to do. I do recommend, of course, just looking over different learning styles. There are education consultants like Angie and other folks who will help you sit down and just pick curriculums. There are stores basically that are for homeschool curriculum, and there are consultants there. There are conferences that are held usually, and I know that there still will be one. Hopefully NCHE will have their annual conference in August. It's usually in May. There are places that you can go and look at that curriculum, open it up, and just kind of see, who's it geared to and that kind of thing. So really, there's not a lot that's required of you. You basically look at your child, and then you just kind of go from there. And that changes, of course, between elementary, middle, high school. Most homeschoolers are going to use some outside resource at some point. I know so few people who have not done that. So, for elementary school, it's going to be very different than when you need chemistry and physics. I did not want to cut up things on my kitchen table for biology. That's just not something I wanted to do. So I farmed that out. We did the bookwork at home, and then they went somewhere else and did the labs, and they got to cut up all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Most people are doing some kind of hybrid like that. And that's the other thing that you can consider, that homeschooling is not somebody sitting in their basement all day with their own books. It is so much more broad than that. And so that's why those resources are out there for you. And pretty much every major area has, within an hour's drive, I would say, you have some kind of resource like that. Because homeschooling has grown so much in North Carolina, we have so many resources that you can go to get those.
That's great. You've given us a number of resources that are very helpful. And I do remember when my husband and I started homeschooling, we went to the annual homeschool conference in Winston-Salem, put on by North Carolinians for Home Education. That's NCHE, which you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing. My husband was in love with homeschooling. He bought every resource he could find in the book fair, because he just loved the idea of teaching our children. And one of the benefits, which you pointed out, is that you learn so much about your children. You learn what their learning style is. I still remember my son couldn't learn his multiplication tables by doing those flashcards. Mm-hmm. And then I figured out he was an auditory learner, and we got a cassette tape and marched around the house doing the multiplication tables, and it was like, voila.
Yes.
That's the great asset of homeschooling, is you can tailor it to your child. So Angie, over the last decade, we've heard quite a bit about Common Core, standardized testing, and other metrics that evaluate classroom learning and pupil progress. And we can all agree that Common Core was poorly executed and had negative effects on students across North Carolina. But the higher concept of voluntary educational benchmarks to measure student achievement and college readiness is something that conservatives have long demanded from our educators. So when you are a homeschool teacher, how can you determine if your children are on track or exceeding their peers in case they go to school at some point?
That's a great question. And not every state testing is required, but in North Carolina, we do have that. That was one of my 4 points, is that we are required to do that nationally normed standardized achievement test. And there are actually several options that we have in North Carolina. I like to break them down into 2 different categories. I have what I call the fill in the bubble test. Do y'all remember those in school, where you were filling in the bubbles, like the CAT or the Iowa test of basic skills, or the Stanford achievement test? Or there is an individualized test called the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. And that's actually the test that I actually do. That's actually what I do with homeschool families, is they come to me I sit down one-on-one with their child, and I do the testing and I observe them, because even though I'm a testing person, I'm always the first to say that a test score does not define your child. A test score doesn't tell motivation. It doesn't tell creativity. It doesn't tell values. You may have worked on, like Brenda was talking about, what your child needs may not be something that that test will even test. So as a parent, I encourage parents to let that standardized test be one piece of the puzzle. And you should constantly be assessing your child. Where are they at? Where do they need to go next? Planning, and then teaching and evaluating how that's going. I remember my daughter Abigail, who's now in college, she was pretty advanced in her math, but she has a learning difference. She has dyslexia. And so her spelling was here and her math was way up here, and she had gotten way ahead in her math. And then all of a sudden she was like, I don't like math anymore. And what had happened is she had gotten so far ahead cognitively, she wasn't ready to go on. So you know what I did as her parent, because I was assessing her, seeing her needs. And this doesn't happen in public school, I can tell you, because I was there. We put it away for 4 months. Didn't even do what we call formal math. Now, we were using math in the kitchen when we were cooking and outside when we were playing. We picked it back up. She finished the book in 1 week. So, we, as a homeschool mom, you get to constantly be assessing your student. And the standardized test is a one piece of that puzzle. And when you come to me and we do the testing, you will get age equivalents. You will get standard scores, you will get grade equivalents, percentile ranks, relative proficiency indexes. And I will sit down with the family and say, this is what this means. This is your child's strengths and this is your child's weaknesses. Now let's see how we can address those. So basically, when you're homeschooling, your child has their own individualized instruction plan.
That's great, Angie. And it's great to know that there is a way to measure and test your child, even when you're homeschooling, just for your own edification as the teacher. I hear so much in the public sphere about the lack of accountability for homeschools. And I think really there's more, because who is more motivated than the child's parent to make sure the child is learning? So thank you for
one little point is, Tammy, is that the law was passed because of the COVID situation that North Carolina homeschoolers are not required to test this year. But many of the homeschool families, they still want to come. And I've had some of them like, I told my kid they didn't have to test. And they're like, oh, well, we want to go see Miss Angie. And then the moms are like, oh, okay, we'll test, just because even the parents want to know. And they need affirmation. That affirmation is very important when you're homeschooling your child, to know that, hey, I'm on track.
Yes, it is. It is. Thank you for pointing that out. Now, Reagan, I'm sorry you've had to sit silent for so long here, but you're the oldest of 8 children who have all been homeschooled. Well, except for the youngest 2 who are not old enough for school yet. But I wonder if you could, and you've gone, just by way of reference, all the way through as a homeschooler, not just through high school, but also college. You did online college. So basically you were homeschooling through college. And I wonder if you could share with us about the different styles of learning that you've experienced in your education.
Sure. So I feel like I've had a pretty decent mixture of about every possible style of learning. So starting whenever I was growing up and being homeschooled, one thing that my mom did that was really helpful is she would write these schedules for us, and every subject would be color-coded. And she would give that to us so that we knew what was expected and what we had to do throughout the day. And she would monitor and guide what we were doing to make sure we were on track. But we were still responsible for getting that done. And so one thing I learned from an early age was, okay, if I'm really focused, I'm going to get this subject done really fast. Whereas if I'm not focused, it's going to take me twice as long. And so I think you learn that even more so being homeschooled, because there's a little bit more freedom and even more of a need to be really focused and have a good work ethic. Because if I were to wake up earlier, I would be able to get everything done by lunch. Whereas if I slept in a little bit later, it would take longer. And so I think there was a lot more independence, and taught me to be really driven and kind of take ownership of my education. And then moving into high school, I took more classes in a classroom setting. So I took a couple online. And then I think, like Angie was saying, some of the sciences are easier to take in a classroom setting. So I would take those there's a local camp here called New Life Camp that teaches a lot of classes. So I did a lot of classes there. And then there are also some independent teachers in the area that, it'd be a big class of maybe like 30, 40 of us, and we would do science classes that way. But moving into law school, I think being homeschooled really gave me an advantage, because law school, there's really no assignments. It's very rare that there's any sort of assignment or deadline other than the final exam. And so that's worth 100% of our grade.
That's great, Reagan. And of course, as a lawyer myself, I do remember the pressure of law school exams, the entire grade writing on one exam. And so I think homeschooling is great preparation for law school in terms of learning how to pace yourself and how to be self-motivated. So anyway, Reagan, tell us when you graduated from high school, how old were you?
Mm-hmm. When I graduated from high school, I was 17, but I was already 2.5 years into my college degree. So that was another benefit, was kind of the timing of being able to work ahead. So my mom had planned out my high school degree where I was able to pretty much get all the credits by the time I was 16, but I had already started my college education. So I finished college before I was 19, and that allowed me to go into law school whenever I was 19, and I'll have my law degree by the time I'm 22. So
that's amazing. And that's another advantage to homeschooling, is because you're self-paced, you can move through all this curriculum at a much faster rate. Well, Angie, what suggestions do you have to help other parents balance the role of teacher, spouse, parent, and even part-time employee outside of the home, in addition to the never-ending jobs of housework, meals, and laundry, especially in those early years when young children need more direct instruction and attention?
Well, the first thing you have to remember is that your house won't always be perfect because you're in your home all day. There's always laundry, there's always dishes, there's always, stuff going on. And so that's something I had to get used to, because I like things, I'm very structured and like things in order. So that's the first thing you need to make sure that you recognize and give yourself, some leeway, that everything doesn't have to be perfect, that your number one job is the homeschool and education of your children. And then you can also help your children learn to help to take care of many of those responsibilities as well. But I work with many families across North Carolina. I work with moms, I work with dads, I work with grandparents. I work with nurses that are a full-time nurse and homeschool their kids. And they have all done a beautiful job. And sometimes it comes down to the sacrifice. If you are called to homeschool, then you will figure out a way to make those priorities work. I work during the day with homeschool families and homeschool my kids. When they were younger, I went to Walmart and I purchased one of those little shoe carts, little metal I think it's Mainstay. I don't know the brand, but it's like a shoe cart with 3 different shelves. And I bought clear shoe boxes. And so when like Amelia was 5, she had shoe boxes with all of her little activities. Maybe she had some puzzles. Maybe she had some clay. Maybe she had some tangrams. Maybe there was a scale where she could measure and weigh things with little teddy bears. And so she had her little box that she would go through while I was working with Abigail when she was 7 on maybe her math or teaching her to read. And what I found out is by the time the one that was 3 years older had gotten through her stuff, she had been listening all along to what I was teaching Abigail. So it's like, oh wait, you already know how to read. It's like I don't even have to teach you how to read, because she was listening to me teach her older sister. And so there are lots of creative ways that you can do to structure your homeschool. I think the key is, like Reagan said, her mom had a color-coded system, and you have to figure out what system works for your family structure. At our school, we often did night school because that was our optimal time for me to teach new concepts at night in our pajamas before going to bed, so that while I was working with a homeschool parent the next morning, I had already taught the new material that they could use in whatever activities or assignments that I was assigning them. And just keep in mind, your homeschool is not going to look like someone else's homeschool. Brenda and I both have similar situations where we were teachers, and I remember my first day of homeschool, and I was so excited. And I had a special room that I had designated for our homeschool, and I put charts and calendars up on the wall, and I set it up just like my classroom when I was a teacher. And at the end of the day, after a couple, I was like, what am I doing? I'm not putting my kids in school. We rarely ever went into that room. Schooling took place at the kitchen table or on the sofa or in the dining room. And so you have to figure out what works best. And you don't have to have a big space. You don't have to have a big space at all to homeschool. So you just have to be flexible and figure out the structure that works best for your family.
That's great. And of course, those are the benefits of homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
Part of them is the flexibility involved. One of the benefits of homeschooling, as we've just been talking about with Angie, is the flexibility and creativity you can bring into the education of your children. Can you tell us briefly about some of the unique learning opportunities that homeschooling has brought to your family?
Well, I love doing hands-on learning, and Angie and I are a lot alike in that respect. Love field trips, love going, and we traveled all across North Carolina to learn about North Carolina. I didn't have a North Carolina history book. We would just get in the car, travel everywhere. And then another part for me was I love civics, wanted to teach my kids hands-on civics. And so we did. I have had Generation Joshua clubs for several years. And basically those are clubs that are sponsored by the Homeschool Legal Defense Association that teach civics in the clubs. And then they also have an action component. And so we did the clubs, and then you and I worked together on a few things in Raleigh for some parental rights. And we also were part of a group that went to work on changing the homeschool statute because we wanted to make it clear that we could have these outside resources. It was a little gray in the statute. And so 2013, there were a group of families that were working on that, and we were part of that. And so my boys were there when they saw the bill in committee. They saw it go to the House, the Senate, back to the House. It was kind of crazy the way that one went. But they were invited to be at the bill signing with the governor. And so they literally watched civics taking place right in front of them, and we just did it. One of the reasons why I wanted to do that with my kids is because I want them to understand that the freedom to homeschool may not always be here. We are just one bill, one Supreme Court case away from someone trying to take that away from us. So I wanted them to see the process, how it works, so that they would be always vigilant to protect that right for future generations. We have such a unique year this year, 2020. We have a homeschooled ad running for 2 of the branches of government, the top position. We have Dan Forrest running for governor. He has homeschooled his 4 children the whole time. We have Justice Newby running for Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, who also homeschooled some of his kids. And then we have E.C. Sykes, who's running for Secretary of State. And we're just so excited to have folks who think like us to help us preserve this right. And so I have my family involved this year, as we have been in many other years, to really look at the candidates that we have and then say, who's going to help us protect this right? And then we're going to go and we're going to do everything we can to try to get them into those positions so that they can help us. And so that's what we do as a family. Our learning does not take place in, like Angie said, in one spot in the house. It's everywhere. We are all over the place, doing as much as we can, hands-on. And so I would invite other people to do the same thing. Don't think about just one way of learning. It has just been an amazing journey, just watching all the things now that I'm looking back at the end, just all the opportunities that we had that so many children will never have. My boys also served as pages in the North Carolina House and the North Carolina Senate. And of course, they just were right at home because they actually could navigate through the buildings, through the LB especially, which, even LA's have a hard time finding the different quadrants when they first get there. So, that was just an incredible experience that I I'm so thankful that we just kind of took the time to kind of put the books aside, because we didn't learn civics in a book. I actually never had a government book for my kids. And they earned college credit, for that class, because they earned a CLEP credit because of all that we actually did. They didn't even have to study but a few Supreme Court cases that were actually in the test. But otherwise, everything was what they actually went out and did. And to me, that's probably one of the most special things from our journey, that I'm so excited that we had those opportunities, that I just kind of looked outside the box of textbooks.
That's great. I think a lot of the benefits are that the education process can be driven by your children. I remember throwing out a science textbook and asking my kids, what do you want to learn about in science? And we made a big list and we posted it on the wall, and we just began to just go out and find every resource and everything we could read on that topic. And the kids loved it. And they were so motivated to learn because they chose the topics. And I also remember another trip we took. My husband had a trip to Hawaii, and we just used our frequent flyer miles and went with him, and we studied Hawaii the whole month before. And then we were able to study about shield volcanoes and tropical fish and the history of Hawaii, and incorporating all of your family trips into the learning process is really a fun thing to do when you homeschool. So I wonder, Angie, if you could tell us what can you expect to pay for curriculum if you decide to homeschool?
Well, you could ask 500 homeschoolers this question and you would probably get 500 different answers with this. There are a lot of things out there that cost a lot of money that are great. There are a lot of things out there that cost a lot of money that I wouldn't pay 2 cents for. But I started thinking about it, and I normally tell people the average. Now, this is just an average. You can probably homeschool and homeschool well in the beginning, maybe $140 a year, to maybe the max about $350 a year. I don't know, Brenda, what would you say your average would be?
Yeah, I probably would say 100 to 200 was probably in the early years. And then, of course, if you're talking about that biology class, that chemistry lab, that physics lab, you're going to pay a little bit more for that.
Right.
So you choose, we made a budget and then decided, okay, how many outside classes can we fit in the budget? And then we just prioritized, those are the ones we're going to do. And then we picked.
Yes.
Well, compared to private school, that's a bargain.
Yes.
Private schools, which can cost anywhere from $5,000 up to $15,000 a year, and public school education costs around $9,000 to $10,000 a year, depending on which county you're in. So, what a bargain, and how much fun to be able to do it yourself. So, Reagan,
and I tell you.
Oh, go back. I'm sorry.
Well, I tell people that you're only required to test once a year. And with the test that I give, you can actually test at any time during the year. It's not a 3rd grade test or a 10th grade test. And so, even though it's not required legally to test this year, I'm encouraging new families that are considering homeschooling in the fall to go ahead and get an assessment now to get a benchmark, and let someone help them to begin to pick out curriculum based on where they are. And one thing that I'm sure Brenda would agree with me, you don't go by the grade on the front of a textbook. Because what Horizons Math calls 3rd grade, another company has that same book, a different scope and sequence. It'll be a different grade. And there are a lot of little tricks you can learn along the way, that if a particular curriculum company has a placement test, it's always a great idea to take that placement test, especially in math, because math always, builds on each other. And so, but as you homeschool, you'll start learning. It's amazing. The Lord will, if you're seeking Him, He will direct your path, and He will show you what's the best thing to do for your kids.
That's great. That's good to know. Well, Reagan, as we close out tonight, one of the frequent objections raised by opponents of homeschool education is the lack of socialization. And critics say that homeschool children are lonely and they crave a greater degree of social interaction, and they may be socially awkward or may experience a feeling of cultural alienation when they graduate and move on to college or the wider world. What activities during your homeschool education equipped you the most, Reagan, and how would you answer all of those objections?
Yeah, I've actually gotten this question a lot, and I hear that a lot just as I've grown up being homeschooled. And I think growing up the way I have, it's almost funny to me because I look at the way my mom homeschooled us, and I would say I think I had more social opportunities just because of the flexibility of my schedule. And I'm sure Angie and Brenda would look at the way they've homeschooled their kids and say absolutely the same. Just because I think first being able to take classes out of the house, I took, I think, all of my science classes with other people. And then my parents had a family friend that I would get together with this girl who was in the same grade as me, and we would do all of our hands-on science experiments together. We would go through our science book and do all of the experiments, and that was really good. So it was kind of a time to be together, but also learn together, which I really enjoyed. But I think being homeschooled also gave me the ability to do a lot of extracurricular activities that I would not have had the time for if I would have been in public or private school. So for me, the main one was ballet, and I danced a lot from the time I was 3 to the time I graduated, and that was pretty time consuming, but I enjoyed that because that was with a local studio, so I had friends there that I would see 3-4 times a week. And then I also took violin lessons and was able to teach in high school, which was good. So I got to teach young students, so they would usually be in preschool and kindergarten. And then I think being homeschooled also really allowed me to be more involved in my church as well, just in the orchestra, and then as an Awana leader, and that, would be a couple times a week. And then Brenda was saying that her boys served as House and Senate pages. I was also able to do that, and then my younger siblings, as they've gone through high school, were able to serve as pages too, which is a really good experience. And that was probably one of my favorite experiences in high school because you get to be with a group of other high school students and you get to be really hands-on and learning how legislation is made, because I think it's one thing to read that from a book, but then to get to have that hands-on experience is so different, and it puts things into perspective. And I think that's one of the beauties of being homeschooled, is because you have the opportunity to learn from the curriculum and read a book and learn that way. But there's also a lot more opportunity to be hands-on and kind of get out into the world and learn from experience, which I have always been really thankful for. Another big thing was I was able to have a lot more internships and a lot more opportunity for volunteer opportunities and service projects throughout high school. And then continuing on into college, as I was finishing up my degree, I interned at the Heritage Foundation in DC, which I would say, since I didn't have the traditional college experience of living on campus, that was my first experience away from the home, which was really good because I was around, I think it was a class of 60 other interns. So it was a pretty decent sized internship. And then being able to kind of have my first experience away was something that I'll always cherish that time. That was a really fun time. So
that's great. What a great summary to all the benefits of homeschooling, Reagan, just to see you and to hear you and your testimony about it. As my husband always says, he never learned anything good on the bus to public school. So anyway, I just was thinking about that as you were talking, Reagan. But thank you all. And I just want to thank you, ladies, for joining us tonight. What a robust discussion we've had. And I appreciate all the experience that you've all had. And we hope that parents across the state have found the resources and discussion helpful as they consider options for this fall. In a future episode, Mike Long, the president of Parents for Educational Freedom in North Carolina, will be joining the show to talk about private school education and the help that Opportunity Scholarships has provided to low-income parents in North Carolina. And it's hard to believe that we're now less than 4 months away from our annual Celebration of Carolina Values dinner in Raleigh on October 6th. You won't want to miss hearing Gianna Jessen's miraculous story of how God has used her in a mighty way since surviving a saline abortion. You can save $35 a ticket by reserving your seat before the early bird ticket deadline on June 20th. I hope you'll do that. Visit ncvalues.org/celebration for more information. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please be sure to visit ncvalues.org to watch past episodes of our program and to support our work. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we will see you next Wednesday for another episode of NC Values Voice. Thank you and good night.
Graduation. It's hard to believe it's time. But before I step through the next door of my life, I want to say thanks. Whether it was my first step or crossing the street, you held my hand and taught me to look both ways, in traffic and in life. You took the time to explain that impossibly hard math problem. You're the one who wiped away the tears when I lost my ball game, the one who clapped the loudest at my recital. You showed me what Christ's love is really like, and taught me He is the only way and my hope for the future. You were the hands of Christ in my life that held me up when I fell, and the feet that walked with me as I stumbled, learned, and grew. You said I was His workmanship, made in His image and immeasurably loved. To my dad, my mom, my grandma, my grandpa, my pastor, my Sunday school teacher, my aunt, my uncle, to my bus driver, my tutor, my friend. You took the time, and I want to say thank you. When I walk across the stage, you will be walking with me, your wisdom and courage, your strength and love, your faith and sacrifice. They're all with me. And one day, because of you, I plan to give all of this to someone else, just like you gave it to me.